I'm going to turn this on now, and we are officially recording as of now onto my screen. And for all questions, as we were kind of discussing earlier, just put them in the chat and I'll filter them to our instructor when appropriate. And yeah, have a great class. Fina, take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Fina. I'm from Ontario. I'm probably doing the earliest period class for the Italian Salon this time because we're going to talk about diet during the Empire of Rome. I have a lot of material to go through. If you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I love to answer questions. And Antonio will help me and we'll try and get them all. If we miss one of your questions, we'll go back through the chat at the end so that we can cover everybody's questions because there is kind of a lot of material. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and turn my video off so that you aren't distracted by me. You can just look at the pretty slides. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, and hello and welcome to the Archaeology of the Roman Diet. I am so excited to have all of you here today. And what I really want to talk about with regards to the archaeology of the Roman diet is what we think we know and what we're learning that we don't know. There's been a long-held belief that the average Roman citizen subsisted on a vegetarian diet of cereals, olive oil, wine, and the more affluent dined on a wide variety of extravagant delicacies. I'm sure we're all familiar with the cookbook of Apicius and some of the descriptions of the food that are contained in that. However, the more recent archaeological excavations that are going on in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum and even Ostia are shedding new light on the diet of the empire. And specifically, they're shedding a new light on the habits of citizens living in the heart of the empire who may not be members of the social elite. The work that's being done in these two cities is demonstrating that early notions regarding the Roman diet may not be entirely accurate. So if you go look and do a Google search on the Roman diet, you're gonna get thousands and thousands of hits and a vast array of search results. Careful reading will reveal that most people have the idea, even today, that the poorest Romans ate badly or even like animals, while the rich dined lavishly on the best and most exotic things. Many of these articles also claim that the vast majority of the Roman population was living in abject poverty. So where do these notions come from? It seems to be picked up from the early 20th century historians. Sorry, let's see if I can figure out why the slides aren't advancing. Okay. Let me try the stop share and we'll try this one more time. I apologize for that. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with my slides.
Most likely Murphy's Law, just the hiccups of having the event, but
okay. I apologize, everyone. Give me just a second. See if I can figure out what's going on with this. I think it's actually PowerPoint that was having the issue. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. It's always the first class, right? There's always a glitch.
exactly.
So where does the idea that the Romans ate a subsistence diet come from? It largely comes from early 20th century historians, from what I can tell. One such historian, Harold Johnson, stated in his Private Life of Romans that grain and grapes and olives furnished subsistence for all who did not live to eat. These gave the wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and the oil to make his face to shine, and bread that strengthens man's heart. On these three abundant products of the soil, the mass of the people of Italy lived of old as they live today. Writing in 1932, Johnston was relating what he knew of what the average Roman was eating now to what was being eaten in ancient times. And I think he does us a disservice on this. Johnston himself was relying on the works of earlier historians such as Joachim Marquardt and Ludwig Friedlander. The works of these historians paint a picture of the diet of the average Roman citizen as one of mere subsistence. It implies that they barely had enough nutrition to survive on and depicts their lives as short and full of pain. They were convinced that the so-called Mediterranean triad, which is the grapes and grains and olives, were the be-all and end-all of the diet of the Romans if you weren't a member of the wealthy elite. Even some 21st century historians like Willem Jongham have written that we assumed that what we knew of Roman life was that it was brutish and short. To contrast this, there are writings of authors who lived during the time of the Roman Empire. Several works from the period shine a light on the agricultural activities that are taking place. Among these are Cato's De Agricultura, the Naturalis Historia by Pliny the Elder, the De Re Rustica by Columella, and these three are basically texts written by gentlemen farmers. They know a lot about agriculture, and I mean, in Pliny's work, for anybody who's familiar with it, is basically the encyclopedia of Roman agriculture. He talks about everything from agriculture, horticulture, botany, viticulture, animal husbandry, even throws in some recipes. Columella does a lot of the same thing. So what do these three texts tell us about life in the Roman Empire? Or specifically, what do they tell us about food growth? One of the things that they tell us is that the region of Campania, in which Pompeii and Herculaneum are located, was famed for its fertility. Pliny the Elder notes in his works that both olives and wine were produced heavily in this region, and he further states that 4 varieties of grapes were grown on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. He goes on to describe several other varieties of fruits grown in the region, while Columella and Cato add to this rich produce background by talking about things like cabbages, varieties of nuts, and even some cereals. From these men come some of the earliest known Roman recipes. Cato's work is the earliest reference from 160 BC, while Pliny and Columella are contemporaries of each other, dating from the 1st century CE. This also makes them a contemporary of Apicius, from whom most of the modern knowledge of Roman cooking originates. Apicius wrote is a misnomer. The De Re Coquinaria, which is attributed to Apicius, the oldest version that we have, dates from about the 4th or 5th century. Many of the 500 and some odd recipes that are contained in the works of Apicius are attributed to him, but it's clear from other texts that these were compiled long after his death. However, approximately 3/5 of the recipes are believed to be written by Apicius himself. And it's on works like these, Cato and Pliny and Elder and Apicius himself, that historians like Johnston based their belief that a diverse and varied diet belonged only to the elites. To contrast the work of these gentlemen farmers, who themselves were members of the elites, we have the works of poets like Horace, Martial, and Juvenal, who provide anecdotal evidence to a certain extent. But the food that they talk about, they themselves describe as being somewhat more middle class. They describe meals that gourmets might have considered humble. For example, Martial talks about a meal consisting only of lettuce, eggs, olives, smoked cheese, fish, and fowl. This is in stark contrast to the lavish meals of the elite, like the one described by Macrobius that contained more than 27 dishes, among them shellfish, 7 varieties of shellfish, 5 types of birds, hares, deer, and wild boar, just to name some of the dishes. Despite the simple words and descriptions, the literary work suggests that even people living a more middle-class lifestyle still had a real gastronomic tradition that existed all the time in the background. Sure, it wasn't the lavish diet of the elites. It probably didn't look like this. But their descriptions of dining focus more on locally available proteins, vegetables, and varieties of cheeses. And while these appear to be more humble than the upper class meals depicted in this picture, they certainly contain a commitment to flavorful food. In fact, Horace goes into detail in one of his satires describing the type of sauce that's supposed to be served with a lamprey. So not only do these writings show us some differences from the elite diet, but they also begin to suggest that what we've been taught by modern history about the Roman diet may not be entirely accurate. In order to correct our assumptions, it's necessary for us to find new data with which we can learn more about the Roman diet. The new excavations taking place at Pompeii and Herculaneum have opened up a perfect window of opportunity for further research. What happened at Pompeii and Herculaneum has created a snapshot of a living community. The events of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE basically enclosed Pompeii and Herculaneum in what is essentially a time capsule. This tragedy, while of epic proportions, literally froze a snapshot, a day in a life. Well, this is not the first incident. Well, the 79 AD or 79 CE eruption was not the first incidence of ground moving in the region. It probably was still of very striking magnitude to the population. The first instance that they had happened around 62 CE. There was a large magnitude quake that had significant damage to both Pompeii and Herculaneum. And we know this because in 79 CE, when the eruption happens, parts of both cities are still in the process of being rebuilt. Many scientists now speculate that that early quake was just the beginning of Mount Vesuvius becoming active. But for most of the residents, they would have been oblivious to the connection between the increased earthquake activity and the fact that the mountain was beginning to wake up. The mountain hadn't erupted in living memory of the populations of Pompeii or Herculaneum. And so as a result, they were wholly unprepared for the eruption that took place in 79 CE. History's best account of what occurred on that day comes from the eyewitness account of Gaius Plinius Secundus, or Pliny the Younger, as he's often known. And as you can see from the map that we have here, Herculaneum and Pompeii really are in very close proximity around the Bay of Naples to Pompeii, or to Vesuvius. And so it makes a big deal when we talk later about how the actual eruption affects the towns. Pliny the Younger, in his letters to the historian Tacitus, describes the violent eruption of the mountain in great detail. His account of the event includes the ash and stone falling from the sky, the enormous cloud of volcanic debris that shot into the sky, and of course, the choking, noxious fumes. He even recounts the efforts of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who made a fatal attempt, as it turns out, to try and rescue the populations of some of the cities. What's clear from Pliny the Younger's account is the suddenness of the eruption and how utterly unprepared the residents of the region were for such a catastrophe. His descriptions have also led to a lot of art depicting what the eruption of Mount Vesuvius might have looked like to the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum had no idea what to do when the sky turned black as night and the air filled with choking ash. Such a circumstance must have terrified them, evidenced by their flight from their homes. And it's clear from the archaeological record that essentially one of two things happened. And there's differences based on whether you're in Herculaneum and Pompeii. For Pompeii, the catastrophe starts happening sooner in Pompeii. Part of this is based on its location and proximity to Vesuvius. Part of this is based on the initial eruption pattern of Vesuvius. And unfortunately, also wind direction makes a big difference. Pompeii begins to experience the effects of the eruption much sooner than Herculaneum. And I know we talk about it all happening in one day, but really the eruption lasted over 2 days. So what we see from the archaeological record, though, is that either people abandoned much of what they had and fled for their lives, or in some cases tried to take shelter in other buildings and died there. Many people who tried to escape still ended up dying in Pompeii because they didn't make it far enough away. Or the eruption pattern changed in the process of their escape, forcing them to take shelter before they could escape the city. Failing to escape, many people took shelter wherever they could, some in a gladiatorial barracks, others in the interiors of homes or in the cellars of larger buildings. In the end, these places where they took shelter would become their final resting places. Ash and pyroclastic flows ultimately buried the town under more than 20 feet of volcanic material, and in the process, buried a wealth of material for later generations to examine. You know, we joke when we're talking about being in the right place at the right time. Location, location, location. But that's really true for Pompeii and Herculaneum. Location, location, location. But in this case, it was a tragedy for the existing residents of the cities and a storage for further generations of knowledge. The impact of the eruption on Herculaneum was no less severe. However, Herculaneum shows a more staged process of evacuation. This is probably because Herculaneum is on the very edge of the eruption zone, as you can see from this map. This means that the citizens of Herculaneum had more time to flee, but they still left a lot of goods behind. Ultimately, Herculaneum citizens were forced to make the same kind of decisions that Pompeii citizens were, which was, what do they take? What do they not take? And it's even clear from some of the houses that were found locked with valuables still inside of them that people thought that they were just going to leave things for now and come back for them later. During the first examinations of Herculaneum, very few remains were found. This led to the belief that many of the inhabitants escaped to safety, and this misconception lasted well into the modern era until remains were located near the ancient harbor. Based on the remains found on the beach and the boat sheds, it's clear that many people fled toward the harbor in an effort to make their escape by sea. The fact that very few boats were found suggests that one of two things: either a great number of people did make a successful escape by sea, or in the process of the eruption, which could have led to changes in tidal flows, some of the ships may have been carried out of the harbor in the process. But it seems clear that some people must have escaped by that route, and perhaps even many, but not all did, as the remains of more than 300 individuals were found in the boat sheds. Herculaneum was sealed in almost 3 times the quantity of volcanic material that Pompeii was. And the reason for this is because the pattern of the eruption changes partway through the eruption process. So while Pompeii got a lot of initial ash and pumice, Herculaneum got more of the brunt of what we now consider the Plinian eruptions, style of eruptions. And the nature of the materials that covered Herculaneum was much more dense and compact than the ash and pumice layers at Pompeii. The nature of the materials that covered Herculaneum created an absolutely wonderful environment for preservation that protected items like carbonized food and wooden objects, which have proved to be rare and significant finds for researchers. One recent find at Herculaneum graphically demonstrates just how violent the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was. In examining the remains of a skeleton found at the Collegium Augustalium, researchers found the hard glassy substance that you see before you, coating the interior of a skull. Chemical analysis has revealed proteins and fatty acids in the substance that are consistent with human brain tissue. As a result of their analysis, researchers were able to determine that the glassy substance was indeed the vitrified remains of human brain tissue. In other words, the enormous heat of the eruption melted the soft tissue of the brain so completely that when it cooled down, it solidified into a glass-like substance. The sudden and overwhelming eruption of Mount Vesuvius sealed these towns away, locking them in a time capsule, and in that moment created essentially a frozen day in the life. Some people got away, but while they did, they only got away with what little they could carry. And indeed, many of them may have believed that they were returning to gather their goods later once the eruption passed. All they took was what they could throw together in an hour or two, perhaps, and that was it. Everything else stayed there, including all kinds of household goods, stored goods, and other things like food still cooking in ovens, and even the contents of latrines. The sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum were left largely undisturbed for many centuries. This picture from the early 19th century shows you some of the digging that's going on. And if you're familiar at all with Pompeii and Herculaneum, it looks nothing like the dig sites we're familiar with today. Herculaneum was originally discovered in the process of digging a well at the start of the 18th century. When it was discovered, they began to nominally undergo excavations, and I use that term loosely, because a lot of what they really did was focus on the material culture that they could remove from the ground and sell to their wealthy patrons. Excavations continued intermittently over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and it wouldn't be until the mid-20th century that excavations would resume, and these would be undertaken in a much more formal and scholarly manner than previously had been done. Herculaneum also suffered from the problem of, remember, it has 3 times the quantity of volcanic material that's buried in Pompeii, and it's a much denser, more compact layer, so it was harder to excavate. Pompeii's story of discovery is not much different. It was discovered by an architect in the 16th century, but not really started to be excavated until 200 years later. Oddly, it was also excavated under the auspices of the King of Naples, who was the main patron for the Herculaneum digs. And again, it was a lot about taking the material culture from the ground, or in instances like this photo before you, when they ran into a dead end, they just punched a hole in a wall to see what was on the other side. The excavations were often done by people with no knowledge or training, and they were not done according to a formal plan. The result was a very haphazard and disjointed process of discovery where major finds were not properly recorded or disappeared entirely, either into an excavator's home or sold off to a wealthy patron. Furthermore, it led to a valuable loss of research, because when they found human remains, they would scoop up the remains and put them in an empty house, which they designated as bone houses, without properly recording where the finds originated from, what was located with the bones they found. In some cases, whole buildings were excavated and then later reburied. Due to the smaller layer of volcanic debris, the excavations didn't suffer the same problems at Pompeii as they did at Herculaneum. It was excavated pretty consistently from its discovery through the 19th century. And it was in the 19th century that we start to have a more formal and plan, because we get somebody who's got a great idea about how to do it. This is an example of one of the bone houses. And as you can see, the bones are just they're just tossed in piles. In the mid-19th century, Giuseppe Ferrelli comes in and is made the chief archaeologist, for lack of a better title, and he puts an end to the uncontrolled digging that had previously taken place. It's to him that we owe the current Regio divisions of Pompeii and the preservation of bodies through casting. I'm sure we've all seen pictures of the Pompeii casts. Giuseppe Ferrelli is the person who innovated this idea, and it saved some data for us, which is fantastic. Despite all of his attempts to keep everything going forward, of course, there were significant pauses in excavations during the early 20th century due to world events happening. There's an unprecedented flow of information coming from the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum right now, and it's shedding new light on Roman life. Archaeologists at these sites are using new techniques and disciplines such as zooarchaeology, archaeobotany, and environmental archaeology that provide new information regarding the diet of ancient Romans based on samples of organic material and bones. Here's a great example. This is an overview of the site at Pompeii and the current excavations that they're working on. And as you can see, everything is being done very carefully. I don't know if it's really clear from the picture on your screen, but in many of the places, especially along here, there are reinforcing beams along here. And then these are protective roofs that have been placed over buildings to protect mosaics and murals that are found inside. So we're doing now as much preservation of the site as we are excavation of the site, because there's always going to be more to find here. The new techniques that we're using in archaeology today are also giving us other places to look that it's never occurred to us to look before. And so we're finding things like rubbish heaps and sewage systems, which have previously been overlooked or ignored by previous archaeologists. Here's a great example. This is a household latrine in the city of Herculaneum. And one thing we should say about household latrines is they weren't just for human waste, they were for household waste as well. Table scraps, scraps from cooking, garbage from your house, it all went in the latrine. Early diggers, as we've said, were much more interested in scavenging material culture. This is evidenced, of course, by the removal of mosaics and murals from places like the House of the Vestals in Pompeii. And as a result, finds that spoke to less material things like food and diet were often not well documented or overlooked entirely. And things like this latrine weren't even examined until the latter part of the 20th century. They did make note of some finds related to the ancient diet, but only when significant quantities of particular food items were found. So what are we talking about? We're talking about notations in archaeological journals that say, oh, we found a dolium of grain or an amphora filled with fish bones. But often these were not recorded in the context of their surroundings. So what do we mean by that? Well, they tell us, well, you know, we were excavating in Pompeii this last summer and we found an entire dolium of grain. Okay, but where in Pompeii did you find it? And often they didn't even record that. And this lack of context really limits our understanding of who ate what was found. It's not until the modern era that researchers began to specifically include environmental sampling and archaeobotanical analysis in their plans for excavation. This more in-depth focus on the foodstuffs of Pompeii and Herculaneum led one researcher to compile a catalog of all the food items found in the towns and the surrounding areas. This work is fantastic because it begins to shed light on the food items found in the region. But again, it's only a jumping off point, because the problem with his catalog is he can tell us everything that was found, but he can't tell us where it was found. So again, we've lost that context of where an item came from. And because we have no context for where it came from, we have no idea who ate it. The continuing excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have given researchers access to additional information and contextual data that paints a richer, more detailed picture of the diet of the average Roman than ever before. Perhaps the most significant of these finds comes from here. This is the Cardo 5. Under the Cardo 5 runs a sewer from which the largest single deposit of food finds in the region has ever been found. According to Andrew Wallace-Hadrill, who is currently the director of the Herculaneum Conservation Project, more than 10 tons of material has been excavated from this location. This equates to some 775 containers, each containing 15 liters of material from the Cardo 5 sewer. What's unique about this is what it is able to tell us about the diet of people in different socioeconomic classes. And here is the Cardo 5. This is an entire urban block that exists above the Cardo 5 sewer. It's more commonly known in archaeological plans as the Insula Orientalis tomb, and this block comprised shops on the ground floor with at least 3 floors of residential living spaces above it. Artifacts discovered in this residential complex seem to indicate that the shopkeepers lived on the ground floor in living spaces adjacent to their shops, while the upper level living spaces were occupied by wealthier, probably upper middle class citizens. All of the latrines in this, or all of the dwellings in this block had latrines, and all of the latrines drained into the Cardo 5. At first glance, it would be logical to assume that there would be an intermingling of refuse from the different dwellings. And here's an access tunnel that leads down into the Cardo 5. So this tunnel is just a little over 5 feet in height and about shoulder width wide. And there are access openings like this one at each end of the Cardo 5. And we know from records that periodically the sewer had to be basically shoveled out. But at the time of the Herculaneum excavation, at the time of the Vesuvius eruption, it hadn't been cleaned in about 10 years. The way the Cardo 5 sewer drains led to a stratification of layers and quadrants. And you can kind of see how they've broken up the quadrants on this archaeological diagram. This stratification provides us a way to differentiate between the deposits from the different levels of the dwellings, and to make some determination about which layers came from the lower class dwellings or the shopkeeper dwellings, and which came from the upper rooms belonging to the more upper middle class. So what did the deposits reveal about what was being eaten by the residents of the Insula Orientalis tomb? Archaeologists found that the block, which they believed housed lower and upper middle class citizens, contained, as they expected, a diet rich in grain, fruits, nuts, and olive oil. These are carbonized figs that were found in the sewer. And this particular find is actually from Pompeii, but they I don't have a picture of the charred barley that they found in Herculaneum. So I stole one of my Pompeii pictures so you could see what the charred barley looked like. And then we also have eggs. To be a little more precise, what they actually found were 84 and 27 different mineralized and carbonized plant taxa, respectively. This is what you might expect to find if early historians' assumptions about a largely vegetarian diet are to be believed. However, they also found the remains of numerous eggshells, like the ones here. The majority of the shells came from chicken eggs, indicating a high consumption of this item, but they also discovered several fragments of goose shell. In addition to eggshells, they found small animal bones belonging to birds, sheep, pig, and chicken. More surprising, perhaps, was the discovery of a variety of more rare food items, including sea urchins and dormice. I promise you, it's not a real dormouse, it's just a stuffed one. This particular dormouse jar actually comes from the Herculaneum site. Dormice are a type of plump rodent considered to be a delicacy to Romans. As well, they also found more exotic foods like dates and spices such as peppercorns and mint seeds. The sewer contents also demonstrated that they ate a diet rich in seafood. Here are just some of the fish bones that were found. On the right-hand side of the screen, those are actually fruit pips, but the rest of those are all fish bones. The researchers identified and studied so far, because they're still going through the Cardo 5 deposits, but so far they've discovered approximately 2,500 fish bones from 70 species of fish and 48 marine shellfish species. Again, we have some more Some more fish bones. The top row, except for the spike, are all fish bones. The spike is from a sea urchin. The bottom row, those are shellfish remains. This variety of bones that they found speaks to a wide variety of marine species being available for consumption. Again, these are more of the shellfish that were found, as is this. And I just love to throw this mosaic in. This mosaic is actually from Pompeii, but it gives you kind of an idea of the variety of sea species that the residents of Pompeii and Herculaneum might have been familiar with. It also suggests some of the species they might have eaten. If the assumptions of the early historians are accurate, there should be clear disparities in the strata from the Cardo 5 sewer between what the lower class residents ate versus what the middle to upper middle class residents ate. The historical perspective would suggest low food diversity for the less wealthy citizens and an absence of expensive food items. Instead, the evidence exhibits a great deal of similarity of foodstuffs from one strata to the other. In fact, many of the same food items, even expensive items like black pepper, appear in the strata of both the lower and the upper middle class residents. This suggests that those who resided in the Insula Orientalis II ate largely the same diet, regardless of their socioeconomic standing. The only exception of this is being evidenced by slightly rarer food items, like goose egg shells, which are clearly appearing in the refuse of the wealthier inhabitants. So, how does this compare to Pompeii? Well, although there's no equivalent of a Cardo 5 in Pompeii, we do have some evidence, thanks to the University of Cincinnati's Porta Stabii Archaeological Research Project and the Pompeii Pastrina Project. There is a significant variety of archaeobotanical finds. The excavations have uncovered at least 10 cesspits in the neighborhood of the Porta Stabii. And while it is by no means as large as the Cardo 5 discovery, researchers were able to remove several cubic meters of material for analysis. The properties in the Porta Stabii, like those in the Insula Orientalis, show us that there were socioeconomic distinctions among the residents living in that residential area. And what these finds have demonstrated is that Pompeii had perhaps a larger variety of foodstuffs than Herculaneum, as supported by the discovery of this butchered giraffe leg. For the most part, however, the finds of Pompeii greatly resemble the finds of Herculaneum and show to a great extent the same level of diversity. Here too, there is a suggestion that the wealthier residents had more access to slightly more rare food items, again with the dormouse and the giraffe. But to a large extent, the same foodstuffs were eaten across socioeconomic strata, including imported spices like black pepper. So in this image, on the left-hand side of the screen is the smaller black pepper. This black pepper seed is a carbonized one from Pompeii. The one on the right is a modern black pepper. And we're still trying to parse whether is the black pepper just larger in the modern era, or did the effect of the eruption process and the carbonization process that it went through shrink it? It's not entirely clear. And again, the one on the left is from the cesspit in Pompeii that is an apple or a pear seed. Because of how small the sample is, it's not possible for them to tell at this time whether it's an apple or a pear because the seeds are the same. So the modern seed on the right is from an apple. The carbonized one on the left is from a pear or an apple, we're not sure. And again, on the left is a carbonized dill from Pompeii and a modern dill from today. So what this tells us, these two finds, is that there's a great deal of similarity between the two cities. They were much alike in their diet, and that diet available to the residents seems to be nutritionally more diverse than the subsistence diet than we previously thought they consumed. But is it enough? Can we just rely on what cesspits and latrines are telling us? Well, clearly we shouldn't. We need a wide variety of data to get a good picture, and skeletal remains are another way in which to examine the diet and health of the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum. By examining specific characteristics of bones, determinations can be made regarding the general health of the population, as bones contain the history of growth, trauma, and disease. Furthermore, by examining the carbon and nitrogen isotopes contained within the bones and trace minerals within the bones, clues to the diets of individuals can be obtained through their remains. Unfortunately, the Pompeii dataset has complications. Like we talked about earlier, the initial excavations did much to compromise the data because of the inconsistency of recording not only where remains were found, but moving remains once they were excavated to bone houses for storage purposes. Here is one such bone house. As you can see, the bones have been disarticulated from each other, which means they're no longer with their originating skeletons. And in many cases, the removal process and putting them in these bone houses led to bones getting fragmented. Dr. Estelle Laser, who's pictured here, is one of the preeminent scientists who's doing bone analysis work on the Pompeii digs. The disarticulation of the skeletal remains led to the bones of each individual becoming separated from each other, and it makes it very difficult for us to identify full skeletons of individuals. An example of what this means for us has recently come to light. DNA analysis has recently been conducted on a skull that has been thought to belong to Pliny the Elder, held by the Museum of Naples. After the DNA analysis was conducted, the researchers could not say conclusively that it is in fact Pliny's skull, although the skull does contain many characteristics that would be consistent with Pliny's characteristics. What they can say for absolute certainty that the jawbone that has long been with the skull belongs to a completely different individual. So you see, when bones get separated from each other, we have a problem putting them back together. Additionally, while Giuseppe Ferrelli did great work for us in casting remains, by doing so, he made it much harder for us to analyze the bones within them. Because once the bones are in the cast, we have no way of looking at them. Until recently, Dr. Estelle Laser is trying to do modern imaging of the casts to see if she can get some more information about the bones contained inside of them. But it's impossible for us to do things other than bone pathology, which is looking at the bones themselves. We can't do trace mineral analysis. We can't do carbon analysis or anything like that. By contrast, the data sample in Herculaneum is much more cohesive. Most of the skeletal remains in Herculaneum were discovered in the latter part of the 20th century, and when they were discovered, they were excavated and archived in a much more careful and deliberate fashion. Because of this, they were cataloged and preserved with an eye towards a more complete analysis. Several types of analysis have been conducted with regard to the skeletal remains. The first of these involves bone pathology, which you can see the two technicians doing here. They're essentially measuring the bones, examining them. With the Pompeii data set, this analysis largely focused on the individual bones that were most likely to yield the most information. These include the long bones of both arms and legs, the pelvic bones, and skulls, including teeth. Unsurprisingly, the teeth indicate that there was a lack of oral hygiene in comparison to what we would consider standard in modern Western societies. And this apparent lack of hygiene could provide some indicators as to underlying health issues, such as systemic infection or other soft tissue pathology. On the other hand, there is a frequency of healed injuries that reflects a certain robusticity in the immune systems of the population. Okay, so what does that mean? People are getting sick or they're being injured, but because they're able to heal, it indicates that they have some access to good nutrition, good environment, and so forth. There's further evidence of certain pathologies of bone that are indicative of osteophytic changes to the bone. These changes demonstrate the presence of conditions like arthritis and other bone conditions that are more consistent with the bones of those who have been able to survive in later adulthood. So what we're saying is people are getting sick, but they're getting better. People are getting bone injuries, but the injuries are healing. And they're having enough good nutrition that they can survive into later adulthood, late enough adulthood to develop conditions like arthritis. Despite the difficulties of the Pompeii dataset, it's still possible to compare that to an analysis of the Herculaneum dataset. The remains of more than 300 intact skeletons discovered at Herculaneum were subjected to similar pathological analysis. What's more, because the skeletal remains were studied while still intact, it's possible to draw inferences about who the people were, which we can't do with the remains at Pompeii. Based on the goods and apparel found with the Herculaneum sample, the Herculaneum remains represent a group of people whose members were of different socioeconomic classes. It would appear that their remains represent a cross-section of Herculaneum society. And these studies indicate that the population of Herculaneum, while prone to some disease, especially in childhood, were largely a healthy population regardless of socioeconomic standing. This would lead us to compare these to the findings of Pompeii. And the findings of Pompeii tell us that the samples that we have largely were fairly healthy. So the Herculaneum sample seems to corroborate the findings of the Pompeii studies. And it suggests, despite the randomness of the Pompeii sample, the citizens of Pompeii were also a largely healthy population. But a pathological examination is not without its limitations. Any examination of the physical changes to the bones themselves cannot necessarily reveal tissues that affect diseases that affect soft tissues or nutritional consumption of the person to whom they belong. Fortunately, we have another way to examine the bones at a more elemental level. In addition to the pathological analysis, researchers in Pompeii have been able to conduct stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of the skeletons. This type of analysis can reveal much about the diets of an ancient people because there's a direct relationship between the type of food being consumed and the isotope signature of the elements found in the bones. So what new knowledge do these studies impart? Well, isotope analysis reveals that the people of Pompeii ate a diet rich in diversity. The food they ate consisted of a range of fruits and vegetables, grains, seafood, and meat of domesticated and wild animals. This data corroborates the archaeological finds of both the Carto 5 and the Porta Stavii. Additionally, it supplements that data by providing quantitative estimates for various food categories. These estimates largely come from nitrogen levels, and they suggest that marine proteins comprised on average between 1/4 and 1/3 of the diet. Carbon levels indicate that the remainder of the diet was comprised of plants and herbivores. Carbon testing, unfortunately, is unable to distinguish between whether the food eaten is just plants or is derived from plant-eating animals. But the finding of plant-eating animals in both the sewer and the cesspit would suggest that the carbon testing is leading us to a belief that they ate both plants and plant-eating animals. The results also show us something interesting. There's a difference between male and female diet in this case, with males consuming slightly higher amounts of protein than females. Stable carbon and nitrogen analysis is still ongoing for the skeletal remains of Herculaneum. However, they have already undergone trace mineral analysis in order to detect other indicators of diet. The analysis examined the remains for traces of zinc, copper, and strontium. The results of this found that the remains contained high levels of strontium and zinc. The levels of these minerals indicate that the residents across economic categories ate a diet high in marine fish, crustaceans, and legumes, but low in red meat. Again, this outcome corroborates the archaeological findings of the two cities. So, looking at the stable, the archaeological finds, the stable isotope analysis, and the trace mineral analysis combined, the question begs to be asked. What does it truly reveal about the previous knowledge of the Roman diet? Is it this? Is it largely vegetarian? Or is it something more? To me, the answer seems simple. While antiquity provided answers to some extent through the poems and other writings, it doesn't give us a fully accurate representation, nor do the interpretations that come to us from early 20th century historians. The overwhelming evidence indicates that the Roman population, including the lower classes, was much healthier and had greater access to wide varieties of foods than originally thought. What all this evidence is really indicating is that the Roman population, including the lower classes, is much healthier than we previously thought. And it indicates that they had access to and were eating a greater variety of foods than we thought. Additional revelations indicate that diet wasn't necessarily based on class. Again, with the Herculaneum sample, we know we had a cross-section of Herculaneum society, and all of them were eating very healthy diets, rich in diversity. But more, a recent discovery in the Aplanta suburb of Pompeii has located some 50 intact skeletal remains. While a full analysis of these remains is still underway, preliminary forensic investigations indicate that while most of the people ate meat and fish, at least one of the skeletons led a largely vegetarian diet. The remains, believed to be belonging to a woman in her early 20s, are particularly noteworthy even at this early stage due to assumptions that she was probably more well-to-do. Scientists base this belief on the fact of the value of the items discovered with her and the fact that there was no indication of hard work wear on the bones. So early 20th century historians tell us only the Roman poor ate a subsistence diet, a vegetarian diet. But here we have a woman of relatively high status whose remains suggest that she led a largely vegetarian diet. This would suggest to us that vegetarian diets are not solely related to poverty. In fact, may not be related to poverty at all. They may instead reflect the availability of choices in the Roman diet. What's also clear is that what food was available was not dictated solely by what was grown in the region. Modern archaeological investigations in the agricultural regions around Pompeii and Herculaneum indicate that there was at least some reliance on outside sources for certain commodities, as much of the fertile ground was given over to more profitable export crops like grapes for wine and olives. It's evident from the environment and fertility of the ground that cereals could be grown in the region, but of the local cereals, not enough was produced to feed the population. Records kept at the nearby Sulpici archive indicate that the region definitely relied on imports of pulses and grains from Egypt. There's also evidence from the cesspits themselves and from import-export records that indicate that dates, peppercorns, and other non-local spices formed a thriving trade in foodstuffs imported from other parts of the empire and beyond. The work being done at Pompeii and Herculaneum begins to paint a different picture of the Roman diet than there has ever been. It can be said that at least for the citizens of these two cities, their diet was more diverse and nutritional than originally believed. It's not the subsistence diet argued by Johnston, nor the extravagant banquets suggested by Apicius, but rather it's something in between. It's tempting, it really is, to make assumptions about the rest of the Roman world based on what has been found in these two cities, but that's stretching beyond the limit of our data sets. More examination is necessary before it can be definitively argued that the dietary diversity of Pompeii and Herculaneum extends to the whole of the Roman world. It's clear that more research is needed on this subject. After all, in the grand scheme of things, Pompeii and Herculaneum are small, very small parts of the empire. There are ongoing excavations at the port city of Ostia that will add still more to the ever-changing understanding of the Central Empire. And of course, similar questions must be asked about the provinces. Because indeed, the Roman Empire is vast. Interestingly, though, archaeobotanical research being done in both the Netherlands and Britain is beginning to show that in both cases, Roman rule coincided with a much better and more varied diet than either before or after the Roman period. So what are they saying? They're saying that the period before Rome had less nutritional diversity and less nutritional health than during the empire. And when the empire leads, the nutritional diversity and the nutritional health declines as well. This, combined with the data from Herculaneum and Pompeii, gives us reasons to believe that other places within the Roman Empire may have had much healthier and more varied diets than historically thought, because these outlying provinces are also showing similar evidence to Pompeii and Herculaneum. While it's too soon to make generalizations about the diets of the whole of the Roman world, this new knowledge is leading us to the tantalizing possibility that the diet of the average Roman was richer and more diverse than we ever imagined. Questions?
I've been looking through the chat, and so far we don't really have any. At this point, if anybody wants to turn on their mic and their camera and ask directly, feel free. We have a couple minutes till the end. But
I love to take questions.
stop the